yours. Everyone is here is eagerly waiting your presentation. Just a quick intro, if you don't mind. I'm gonna attempt to.
Yeah,
Um, Jarryd Huntley is a, can I call you an OG JGDS member at this point in time? I mean, you've been
I think
the
I
Discord
was
for a
I was
while.
on the old Slack, so yeah, I think so.
Yeah, he's one of the OG JGDS members, but from the Slack days. Uh, he has been around for a while. He's given us a lot of information, especially from the more established perspective. He is an Ohio-based dev. His company Polytundra has published a couple of titles and has been responsible for a couple porting of other games. His main, I don't know if this is your main claim to fame, but uh, Art Club game is your first major release, and you accidentally became an author for programming for artists. How does that sound for a comprehensive intro?
Yeah, no, you covered everything, so that's good. Thank you.
All right. Like I said, it's a pleasure to have you showcasing your many secret bits of knowledge. And the floor is yours.
Great, appreciate it. Thanks, Glenn. Let me share my screen to make sure everyone can see it properly. Um, is everyone able to view that?
Yep. Yep.
Okay. Great. All right. So, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here and share some knowledge and experiences and bumps I've learned along the way, and hopefully it helps other people and people find it useful. So, uh, as Glenn mentioned, my name is Jarryd Huntley. I'm based in Cleveland. My background's in programming. I'm lead programmer on a project called We Are OFK, which is a really cool interactive series coming later on this spring. And I'm here to talk about production pipelines. And so um, this is something that I feel, doesn't. It's kind of a niche topic, and I feel like it's not in a lot of talks, but it's something that, you know, whether you're a small one person, solo indie, or you're a 20-person studio or even a large studio, this is something that helps your games become more successful. So that's something I want to talk about. So to start, what is a production pipeline? This was something I looked around for a definition, and it's one of those things that everybody has a little bit of a different definition of, and there's not one clear, solid definition. One that I found was by a gentleman, Scott Sladden. I liked his definition. He was specifically talking about art pipelines, but he says in game dev, a pipeline is a clear methodological process to produce assets and features that go into a game. So if we're talking about a production pipeline as a whole, um, rather than features and assets that go into a game, a production pipeline is a process and a procedure that helps us produce a game. So another analogy that I think is good to think about is it's just a conveyor belt, an assembly line. You have the art department, you have the QA department, you have the development, production, uh, engineering, design, and they're all different stations. If you imagine like one of those Looney Tune conveyor belts where, each step of the machine has something that it adds onto that process. And that's one way to think about a production pipeline when we're talking about games. So where do you start? So say you're at the beginning of a project, you have an idea, and you want to figure out how to produce a production pipeline. So there's three main parts, main places that I think would be good to start. And they're all a little bit related, but all a little bit different. So An MVP. So an MVP is just kind of a specific type of demo. An MVP, sometimes you'll hear it called gray boxing, but basically it's just the smallest demo that has the features you want to demonstrate in your game. So if you want to create a racing game, maybe like Mario Kart or something like that. You don't want to focus on the art. You don't want to focus on the sound effects. Maybe it's just literally a cube going around a track. You want to make sure the drifting feels good, that the steering feels good. That's what you're focused on in an MVP. With a vertical slice, rather than just focusing on those core mechanics, you focus on a little bit of everything. So you kind of imagine forward to your game's release and what it might look like. And instead of building out all the systems and trying to figure everything out, you might just say, all right, let's build one track for this kart racing game. Let's have the drifting mechanic. Maybe we won't do AI because that's a whole nother thing. Um, but you want to make it as close to your vision as the release product as possible. But rather than going, rather than going the distance and having a ton of content, we're just trying to get as small of a chunk as content as possible and produce it at a releasable quality. And then a visual target is sometimes it's not even interactable. Sometimes a visual target is just using concept art, using mock-ups. I've seen visual targets where um, it's in engine. So rather than a vertical slice where you're integrating some of the mechanics, a visual target might just be uh, let me put all the assets in a scene and I can move the camera around and maybe there's an idle animation. So that we have an idea of what we're aiming for in our game, and it can kind of be, you know, a guide stone for the process, the team, and even as an individual, what you're working towards. So I would recommend, starting out with one of these three, or sometimes there's a little bit of crossover, but through that process of creating one of those is kind of um, the intentions. So what are the goals of figuring out a production pipeline and generating one? Um, so one is to be as efficient as possible when production starts. So a lot of this would be in the pre-production phase before you start producing content that will eventually end up in the game. Pre-production is where you answer all the questions, you figure out as many unknowns as you can, um, and you come up with a good plan. So when you hit the ground, you can hit the ground running. So you want to find all the production pitfalls and develop solutions for them. So maybe it's a situation when you're like, oh, our art tool doesn't quite talk to our engine properly. There's some manual steps that need to happen in between. This is something that you want to find out and generate a solution for in your production pipeline. And we'll talk a little bit more about ways of attacking that in a few minutes. You also want to minimize human error. Um, we're all humans. We're making games. And there's all of us know there's a lot that can go wrong when you're making a game. And so you want to figure out all the places where, um, maybe, you know, you're 2 weeks out from launch and you're making a build and you forget that, you have to click this button and then you have to export this file and you have to edit it by hand. That's something you want to figure out early on. So when you're needing to produce builds or create a patch very quickly, that you don't have to worry about those types of things. So you want to automate as many tasks as you can. You want to generate procedures. Sometimes it's a written procedure, so you can follow it through step by step by step. Sometimes it's just a process or an activity that you go through. But you want to make sure that you take the thinking costs out of those types of tasks. But also, one of the things with pipelines is it's valuable as a team of any size, but it's also valuable as a solo dev. Um, with a solo dev, there's that meme of being an indie game developer, especially a solo dev. You wear a lot of hats, And sometimes you have your art hat on or your programmer hat, your marketing, your design hat. Sometimes when you're switching those hats, you forget about a task or you forget about a process. So figuring out a pipeline that you can follow when you're producing your game, when you're in production early on is a great way to keep yourself from forgetting things, or to even just help release some of the mental stress of needing to switch back and forth. But like I was just saying, it lets you focus on the game and not the processes. So you can focus on creating the game, but you have kind of a step-by-step list of things you can go through, and it basically helps you create a roadmap. Um, so let's talk about some ways of you know coming up with ways of solving your problems and making your pipeline more productive. So the one that I love, and if there's like one takeaway from this talk, this is kind of what I'd emphasize is building tools. So editor tools are your friend. So Unity and Unreal both support building editor extensions or plugins, enhancing the editor, and just building tools into whatever engine or IDE you're using. I think is oftentimes overlooked. So, what are some examples? So, for example, there's a project I was working on, and um, we needed to trim some audio for a specific purpose. So we could have easily, had the audio in the project and opened something like Audacity, and then gone into Audacity, trimmed the audio, re-imported it back into Unity, and then that totally would have worked. But in just listing that, that's about four different steps. At those different steps, there's something that somebody could forget, somebody could do wrong, they could name the file wrong. There's a lot of human error in there, and so generating. I had never actually done trimming audio in Unity, so the process that I went through. Unity uses C# as its language. I was familiar with generating editor tools, so, you just go into Google, search C# audio trimming library. Found an audio trimming library. I dropped into the Unity project. Um, you can do things like grab this whatever asset is selected in Unity and pass that to the library. And with a couple of hours, I had a tool in the editor that let me trim audio. One of the things that is super cool about that is now it's all in one place. And there's this concept called context switching, and it's comes up a lot in programming, but it also comes up in just jobs and working on a task. And context switching is basically you have your brain in one mindset and you're thinking about one type of task. So think maybe you have your programmer hat on, but you need to work on art. That's a context switch to thinking about art. But another time that a context switch happens is each time you switch a program. So if you need to jump from one program to another program to another program, each one of those is a little bit of a mental context switch. So the number of times that you can minimize that, the better. So if you generate tools in Unity, in Unreal, um, it minimizes those context switches and it kind of focuses everything in one place. Another good tool that's overlooked sometimes is Excel or Google Sheets. If you have data, you can write, a function in Excel. You can set up the formulas to where you can drop your data in. It does the transformation and gives you exactly what you want. There's a Twitter bot that I wrote last year called Stop Doom Scrolling, and it was, a bot to just, kind of comically remind people to stop doom scrolling. And I actually wrote that bot in Excel. I figured out the format for it. I can just add whatever um, different combinations of phrases that can connect together. So I just type in as many as I want, and then I copy from one field and just paste it into the bot interface. And so that's just an example of using Google Sheets as a way to automate something that could have been tricky. So another example is in my game Art Club Challenge. In Art Club, there's if you're not familiar with the game, it's a mobile game that teaches people how to make art through puzzles. So you're presented with a challenge like create a bluebird or an ocean sunset. Then just using rectangles and squares, you need to create your piece of art. You can upload it to an online gallery and share it with people all over the world, but there's also a little story in the game. So there's a story mode where you're presented as a student in an art school, and you need to impress this professor. And so it's a little bit like a visual novel type dialogue interface. And I was using an engine called Construct 2. And so with the story for the dialogue engine, I bought a plugin. I think it was a few dollars on the asset store for Construct. Then I just started modifying it. And at first, I was trying to write the story in Excel, but if you can see, trying to see how the story is in Excel, and there's commands that are inline, they're a little bit hard to read, was a little bit tricky. And like I was saying earlier, it has all those context switches. There's a lot of human error. So I started just redesigning this tool in the interface that came with the plugin, and redesigned it for my game. That way I could use the engine. I would just run a specific scene, and then I would be able to start editing the dialogue. I would be able to preview it with the tools, and it shortened kind of the iteration time between writing dialogue and seeing it in the engine, because I was using that concept that we spoke about earlier of kind of condensing everything and into one tool, kind of under one umbrella. So at the top up here is Excel, or where I was originally starting at. Down here is just interface, and it's not the most user friendly, but it works. It's straightforward. Um, and if needed, I'm able to export it as different formats. But then this is what it looked like in the game. So once I processed the dialogue from here, I was able to put it into the game without needing to go through an import export procedure, things like that. Another tool that kind of builds off of those is asset stores and open source. So I'm working on a personal project right now, and I'm likely going to use Ink as a dialogue framework. And so with using Ink, I'm able to build off of um, existing tools to work on the dialogue engine for it. The cool thing about Ink is that it lets you write the dialogue and then preview it in the Inky editor tool itself. So you just click a button, preview, and then it lets you start playing through, clicking on the choices, previewing the dialogue. And so if, for example, I end up working with a writer on this project, I can say, hey, use this tool. You can preview the dialogue. They can know, that choices work. And it's not a process where it's like, all right, write the dialogue and then, open Unity and then copy these files over and then run the project. And then each time you want to change something, you have to go through that process again and again. It's just kind of self-contained in that tool. But what's nice about Ink and Inky, the editor, is that they're open source. So if there's features in it that don't meet your needs, you can always hop in there and modify them. Another thing is using just assets from the asset store or the Unreal Marketplace. And sometimes in game development, I feel like there's this idea that if you didn't write all the code yourself, then you're kind of cheating or whatnot. And I don't personally buy that at all. Anything that helps you get your game done, I think is a great thing. Um, but I think a system that really works out well um, is evaluating different assets and kind of thinking about them as outsourcing. But even if you're a solo dev, um, if you can afford an asset that's utilizing the work that someone else has put in, paying for it, and then kind of outsourcing that development effort. Also with open source and a lot of code on GitHub, sometimes those assets are free, and so you're just able to download them. So a system that I typically use is even as a solo dev, figure out an hourly rate for yourself. So even if you're not paying yourself, while you're making your game, figure out what you feel like your time is worth. $40 an hour, $60 an hour. Just whatever rate works for you. And when you're looking at an asset, use that hourly rate you calculate for yourself to figure out if you want to purchase an asset. So um, you can basically do a cost benefit analysis. So, on the Unreal Marketplace, uh, there's this VFX tool called Fluid Ninja that makes doing fluid simulations and like dynamic smoke and fire and lava, and it's super cool looking. Um, and it's $50, and you might say, $50 is a little bit expensive, but say your hourly hourly rate you come up for yourself is $35 an hour. Is that's what you'd be ideally looking for. Then you look at an asset like this and think to yourself, could I develop this in less than 2 hours? Could I, develop a VFX dynamic fluid simulation framework. And you know, I've done some research into things like this, but even knowing what I know, I definitely couldn't develop that within 2 hours. And so um, you can think about that money as an investment in your game and kind of outsourcing that cost. Because one of the nice things is that as long as you're checking reviews and there's recent reviews and the asset is kind of regularly updated, you have support with that as well. So, if you use one of these tools or one of these assets and it turns out that you run into a bug or sometimes a feature is missing, you can just, hit up the dev on, the forum or an email. And a lot of times they're like, oh yeah, that's a great idea. Or, I'll think about that and add it to the feature list. Um, Sometimes you can start a relationship with these developers and to doing some custom development to help you along. That way, you know even if it's a more expensive plugin or something like that, there's some plugins on the asset store that are in the hundreds of dollars, 250. But if you don't think that you can develop a plugin like that within that time, um, you can figure out if you want to invest in that. So another thing, when you're planning your production pipeline that I feel is very much overlooked is preparing for disasters. So disasters always happen. Sometimes they're small disasters, sometimes they're big disasters, but you always want to make sure you're prepared for them. So the number one thing I'd recommend is some type of backup or some type of version control. Um, I, I purposely didn't get too into it in this slide because this is honestly a talk on its own, and at some point I'd like to write a blog post on just different version controls. But some people are very strongly, you have to use this version control or you have to use that version control. I say, use whatever works and whatever is easiest for you. And then also accepting the risk. So, say you're using Dropbox for your version control and you back up once a week, you're accepting a risk of losing up to a week's worth of work. So, if that's not something you want to risk, then look into something that's a little bit easier, something a little bit more automatic. But if you're more likely to use Dropbox than to use, Git or Subversion or something like that, then use use Dropbox by all means. You want to use what works for you and what what's the least resistant for you to use. So we spoke about a bunch of different concepts and things, but what are some ways to put this into practice? So these are some tasks that I feel like are often overlooked, um, and that are good to practice when you're putting together your production pipeline. So passing art through entire workflow. So a lot of times, a game dev they'll start, either with the code or with the art, and you might start working on all the art, and then you switch over to work on all the code. Um, but sometimes when when it comes to taking the code and putting it in the engine, you're like, oh, my UVs are flipped. Oh, the coordinate system is wrong. And then you go back and you do animation. Then you bring the animation in the engine, and you're like, oh, the animation is not playing at the right frame rate. So figuring out that entire workflow, bringing maybe it's just one model, you work on everything on that model and just practice, bring it through the workflow, from a start of a asset to a finished asset that you can use in your game. A lot of times, almost always, you'll find something in that process that that breaks down, and that's a way to develop a tool for it. Sometimes you might need to develop just a little script um, to flip the UVs or something like that. Um, that's kind of what I was talking about before with editor tools. Is even if it's something where it's like, oh, I just need to go into a text file and change an X to a Y and a Y to an X. I would just write, an editor script for that. Have it just be a drop down where you just click a button. It just makes things a lot easier. Other thing that's a lot of times overlooked is onboarding a new dev or a new PC. Um, so even if you're working solo and you're thinking about working with people down the road, practice what it's like to set up your project from scratch. Because a lot of times you'll have your project working on your laptop or your PC, and then you'll bring it over to a new PC. Whether you get a new PC, whether your PC breaks, like one of those disasters, and you'll spend a week trying to get your project to run on this new machine. So I feel like this is a worthwhile activity to go through, especially if you're planning to work with other people. And this is also something good for you. Maybe your hard drive dies and you need to restore everything from a backup. Um, I've heard of this happening, weeks before launch. If you have weeks before launch, you want to make sure you can actually restore your project from a backup, because a backup that doesn't contain everything is a useless backup. So I think onboarding and going through that exercise is a good practice. Another thing that I've seen a lot of people get caught up at, and myself included, is making builds. Sometimes you'll just have your project in Unity editor or Unreal, and then when you go to make a build, everything breaks. The textures don't show up, you're getting errors, the game doesn't launch. Um, and so if this is a project you're working on, I would recommend, once a week or every other week, but on some sort of regular cadence, making a build and just going through that. Because sometimes, you'll introduce a change that might break the build. And, say you're working on your game and you have a festival submission, you don't want to find out, hours before that festival submission, that your game doesn't work when it's exported. So the way to not get caught with that is to make regular builds and just test those. Sometimes it's just making sure it opens and you can move the character around, but just going through that is a good exercise. Another thing is writing documentation. So everything we've been talking about with figuring out where things break down, uh, how to bring art from one tool into another, how to export your game, things like this. These are all great candidates for documentation, and I would not overlook documentation. You might be like, oh, this is something I remember. I've done this before. How could I forget? So the process for building my game Art Club Challenge is, I think, is either an 8 or a 10-step process. It is exporting the game from Construct 2. It's zipping the game up and exporting it to a Mac. It's building the project on a Mac. It's going into a file and editing some files manually. Then it's building the App Store executable from there. And there's all these little tiny manual steps. And this wasn't something I documented at the time, and I wish I did. Um, because whenever I have to go in and update the game, um, I'm going to need to relearn this process again. So writing documentation, even for yourself, is something that's super valuable. Also, with writing documentation, when you're onboarding someone else, it makes it so much easier to just hand a process off to someone else. For example, there is a project, and I needed to write some documentation for something, and at the end of it, I'd spent an entire day, an entire workday working on documentation. And at the time, I was like, I wish I would have been able to do that faster. I wish I, that I didn't feel productive writing that document. But then what happened was I was able to hand that document off to someone else later on, and they were able to follow the document step by step and not ask me any questions. Then they were able to forward that document to somebody else to answer somebody else's questions. So when you're writing documentation, that can just make the whole process, unbelievably more smooth. And also, once you do that process of writing documentation once, it can just scale, theoretically infinitely. You can pass a document off to whoever. Um, but either writing document for other teammates or even for yourself in the future is super valuable. Another thing to practice is uploading builds to platforms. Every platform is different and every platform is painful, whether it's Steam or iOS or Android. And so practicing getting a demo, or, maybe it's not what you want to release, but just getting an executable up on whatever store. And most stores allow you to do some sort of beta. So, getting your game up on the iOS store or on Steam, and then just downloading it on a completely separate computer and making sure that process all works, um, is something that I feel like, on top of making builds, maybe once a quarter, you go through that. Because another thing that's unfortunate with these platforms is that they change. And so, the way of uploading an app for the App Store has changed countless times. Steam has new requirements. And so being up to date and not getting caught with this, the Friday when you plan to go live, is a good thing. And then we spoke about this a little bit before, but rolling back to previous versions. So just going through that exercise of maybe simulating losing your computer, or sometimes it's you've had a mishap in development. You rewrote some code and it works, not the way you wanted it, or it works less efficiently than you want, and you want to go back. So make sure that you can actually do that. And then the last one I have here is just making patches. Um, so, going through that process of patching your game, or pushing an update to it, because unfortunately, on a lot of these stores, it's a separate process to go through to patch things than to make builds. So being familiar with both of those. But, and just kind of wrapping things up, with production pipelines, you want to think about the assembly line, and whether it's, an assembly line that has one person on multiple stations, or multiple people on multiple stations. You want to think about the steps from um, bringing, an asset from the beginning to your engine. You want to think about the steps of removing the human element, human error. So you want to develop tools, you want to develop editor extensions where you can just automate things. And when you're in the thick of it, when you're rushing to get your game done for a deadline, or it's to submit for a conference, you'll have all these things figured out. That way, you get caught with as few surprises as you can. So yeah, I want to thank everyone for listening to my talk, and then I think we have some time for questions.
All right. Thank you, Jared. Yeah. So we're moving on to the questions. If you want, uh, Jared, I think you can just look over to the chat, the Crash Course chat. We've been making a habit of posting questions there.
Mhm. All right. Do you make a pipeline for pre-production? I've started a prototype with some other people, and at times it gets a little hard to see where we should focus. So on that question, I think I would focus on what we spoke about with the MVP or the visual target or vertical slice, because one of the purposes of going with one of these items is to just simulate a little bit of all the parts of development, and especially with the vertical slice. If you have kind of a concept together, maybe the vertical slice is what you want to go for, but basically you want to simulate all the processes of development and figure out where you're going towards. And after you're done with the vertical slice, you can say, hey, we liked this part of the vertical slice, or you know we didn't like this part, but it can help you figure out what worked and what didn't work, and kind of give you some direction on what you need to build out in your production pipeline. But especially in pre-production, it's a time to learn about the project and figure things out. So um, I like to think of coming up with a production pipeline as a part of pre-production. So I wouldn't focus on um, needing a production pipeline in pre-production too much. Um, Writing documentation for anything you plan on delegating. Yep, that's anything that you think um, somebody else might have a hand in. I think is super valuable. Um, and yeah, even not even development stuff. So if it comes to marketing or art, or just promotion, or what types of tweets from the official account, um, I think can be super valuable. Yeah, no, I agree that yeah, when it comes to community management, types of docs, specifically of variables, enums. Yeah, um I'm trying to think. There's a name for a type of document like that. Um but it's basically kind of like a glossary, or a library where um an onboarding document, as I've heard it referred to before, with if somebody hasn't been in project before, just letting them know the types of things they might see, or how things are set up. How do I personally decide what goes into the MVP? Um, so one thing that I've been doing recently is doing multiple MVPs, because I think that's kind of one of the dangers of MVPs is if you try to put too much into it, it starts getting into the vertical slice territory. So what I've been doing is an MVP for different features. So maybe I'll do an MVP for the dialogue, and then an MVP for the racing part of the cart game, and then an MVP for the battle system. And so that way, each one of them is small. Each one of them is focused, because once you start getting into the place where you have an MVP and then you're building another system into it, that's like moving a little bit into production. And then you're losing one of the benefits of an MVP, which is that you don't have any existing code to worry about breaking. So if you separate out those MVPs, um, you can kind of isolate building out those features. Um, any other questions? All right. Well, if there aren't any other questions, okay.
All right, hang on, give me a sec.
Graham has one more
Just
question.
thinking.
How does feature feature creep? Yeah, feature creep is something we all deal with. So I didn't really talk about too much of the design side, but kind of tied in with production pipeline um, is referring to the documentation and updating documentation. So um, there's game design documents and there's all different kinds of game design documents. How I prefer to do game design documents is kind of having two. One game design document that's kind of like a Bible. It has everything in it. It has a ton of information, and then just a one pager. I'm a big fan of just like the one page game design document where um, it just summarizes, kind of the main things that you want to have in mind when designing features or adding things to your game. Because I think condensing it down to fit on one page is a good exercise in making sure that you don't have too much. Um, but as part of this production pipeline, you can make it a habit to revisit your game design document, once a week or once a month. That way, you're kind of always course correcting. There's also that saying that game design documents should be a living document. So um, should be changes to it. There should be updates. And so if you're revisiting it on a regular basis, you're continually updating things and seeing where things fit. That doesn't specifically answer the feature creep, but I think, like I said, I'm a fan of the one page game design document, and that's kind of my personal way of managing feature creep. Is if your one page your one pager becomes a five pager, uh, you might need to step back a little bit. All right. How does pre-production and production for games differ from traditional software programming? Hmm. Um, I think it differs in, pre-production. You kind of want to validate your ideas because that's one of the things that makes development a little bit different from traditional software development. Is if you need to make an app that reminds you to feed your dog, at certain times a day or something like that. Uh, you can, figure out, the technical needs. You need a login system. You need to be able to add tasks. You need to be able to add times, and then you need to trigger a reminder. You can develop that, and at the end of the day, like 9 times out of 10, like if you meet that criteria, you'll be done. With game development, you can come up with an idea for a game. Um, you can write the game design document. You can create the game and it not be fun. And so I think a big part in pre-production that differs from traditional software programming is that um, a lot of times with an MVP or a vertical slice, you're trying to confirm that design. You want to make sure it is fun. You want to make sure that it's engaging. So traditional software, doesn't really have that same problem. Um, um, Stuff with deals with the story of the game. Yeah. So as far as adding, um, like narrative elements to your documentation, there's different ways of doing that. I've seen kind of the same thing like in a one pager. It can be kind of like a one pager for the story or um, the story or the characters. So um, you know having a one pager that's just for the narrative where it's maybe all your main characters, a short summary of the story, and then maybe the major plot points. That way, it's like if you go onto IMDb and you look at the synopsis for a movie, it's kind of like that, where you don't need to get into every single detail, or you don't need to get into um, deep into this the narrative and the different parts of it. but it can help people understand what the story is about, or if you need to quickly be reminded about something, you don't need to read through the entire story. Let me know if that answers your question. Yeah, no, that's a great suggestion. Don't forget to cut the list as necessary. Um, yep, no, that's great feedback on the one-page game design document. Yeah, and I agree. Having easy access to just the different um, bullet points of a game or a project or a narrative makes it easier for people to refer to them. If the only place to figure out where something happens in the story is a 50-page narrative document, people aren't going to open it. But if there's a one-page summary, people are more likely to refer to it. And the same with the game design document. Any other questions? I do still play bass. It's um I haven't played it recently, but I pulled out one of my basses and was playing around with it, and I'm just thinking, yeah, I need to get back into this. So, yep. All right. Well, if there's not any other questions, I want to thank Glenn for inviting me and giving me this great opportunity to share some of my experience, and everyone for hanging out and listening. I'm on Twitter. I threw my Twitter up earlier, and I think the talk was recorded. So um, yeah, if there's any questions that people have, or want to chat, I'm on Twitter. I'm also here clearly, so yeah, exactly. I was like, I'm also here. So yeah, hit me up here. If you at me, I have those alerts on, so I'll see it. And yeah,
All right. Thanks again, Jared. It really does mean a lot. And yeah, thanks to everyone else for popping in and being part of the crash course. Jared, one final question: would you be okay with sharing your presentation?
oh, absolutely, yeah.
All right, cool. Because we have a little archive of all the crash course and the materials for any other latecomers or anybody who wants to review the session afterward.
Yeah, no, I'll share that link.
All right, cool. Cool. Also, welcome, Verdane. Very sorry our PR efforts aren't the greatest, but yeah, JGDS is a thing. Hope you hang around. All right, guys. I think that's it, and peace.
All right, thanks again. Bye.
Bye.